A Journey from System Builder to Survival Scientist Part 1 Number 1627, the 5th of May 2026, Gerald C. Shue, Eclairon Foundation, Category, Self-Reflection. Introduction. I only began developing this kind of deep self-reflection about 5 years ago, when I was approaching age 74 and was already halfway through writing my medical research papers. Before that time, I was too busy moving forward through different stages of life: engineering, business building, development, investment, survival, chronic disease control, and later stroke recovery. I was always solving the next problem in front of me. Only later, after writing hundreds of medical papers and spending years reviewing my own longitudinal data, life trajectory, and thinking process, did I begin stepping back and reflecting on the larger picture of my life. Gradually, I realized something surprising. Although the fields I worked in appeared very different externally, I was actually following the same underlying pattern, the same structural logic, and the same thinking style throughout my entire life. Whether I was building semiconductor systems, managing companies, designing AI-related systems, allocating capital, analyzing biomedical data, studying psychology, or controlling glucose fluctuations, using viscoplasticity and topology on my medical research subjects, my mind was approaching the problems in a remarkably similar way. I was always searching for the dominant variables, the interaction mechanisms, the instability sources, the feedback loops, the trajectory behavior, and the long-term survivability of the overall system. Only in later life did I fully realize that this systems-oriented thinking had become deeply embedded into my mental architecture decades earlier. In some sense, my medical research was not a completely new direction. It was more like the continuation of the same systems thinking journey, but applied to the most important and personal system of all, my own body health and survival. Systems thinking across my life. Throughout my life, I have fundamentally been a systems builder and systems optimizer. Earlier in my career, I applied this way of thinking to science, engineering, AI, semiconductor chip design, business scaling, capital allocation, and long-term real estate preservation. Later in my senior life, after facing 9 times of serious health threats, I redirected the same systems-based mindset toward glucose control, stroke prevention, aging, psychology, pathophysiology, topology, viscoplasticity, and biomedical system dynamics. Although these fields appear very different on the surface, the underlying structure of my thinking has remained remarkably consistent. I constantly try to identify the primary or dominant variables, understand their interactions, monitor longitudinal trajectory behavior, reduce instability, and improve the long-term survivability of the overall system. Looking back now, I realize this systems-oriented way of thinking began much earlier in my life than I originally understood, even during my engineering years. I was never only interested in isolated components. I was always more interested in interactions, flow behavior, dynamic stability, feedback mechanisms, nonlinear amplification, and long-term trajectory evolution. Early foundations. Admit in the early 1970s, I was exposed to mathematics, physics, engineering, solid and fluid mechanics, dynamic plasticity, concepts, and systems thinking that later became deeply embedded in how I approached almost everything in life. At that time, I did not yet realize how deeply those early intellectual foundations would eventually intertwine and shape my later medical research decades afterward. Before age of 50, I already experienced wealth, leadership, recognition, and business success. I built companies, led top-tier engineers, managed large high-tech organizations, developed advanced semiconductor technologies, participated in AI-related system development, and experienced both extreme business pressure and large-scale success. I also experienced repeated failures and just legal battles, financial uncertainty, and enormous psychological stress during different phases of my career. These experiences became important later because they taught me something fundamental about systems. Long-term stability is far more valuable than temporary peak performance. From external systems to human survival, over time, it became increasingly clear to me that I had gradually transitioned from building external systems to optimizing the most critical internal one, and physiology, health, and longevity. Therefore, my later medical research work was never driven by fame, power, money, institutional status, publication prestige, or external approval, my motivation gradually became much simpler and far more practical. How can I stay alive? How can I slow down chronic disease progression? How can I avoid another stroke? How can ordinary people reduce risk before irreversible damage occurs? After suffering from multiple chronic diseases, including severe diabetes complications, kidney problems, neuropathy, retinal damage, cardiovascular risks, and eventually a recent hemorrhagic stroke, my focus shifted almost entirely toward survival, recovery, and long-term functional preservation. Engineering thinking applied to medicine began approaching the human biomedical system similarly to how an engineer approaches a complex industrial system under stress. Identify the dominant control variables, stabilize the overall system, reduce accumulated damage, monitor trajectory drift, prevent catastrophic failure before it happens. This is why many of my papers repeatedly focus on prevention, trajectory behavior, system stability, lifestyle control, and practical implementation instead of pharmaceutical promotion, theoretical elegance, or institutional acceptance. My mathematics, physics, and engineering background strongly shaped how I approached biomedicine. In academia, researchers often pursue elegant theories or novel mechanisms. As an engineer, however, my instinct has always been to search for fail-safe structures, practical implementation, and long-term operational stability. Gradually, my thinking also moved away from the traditional Newtonian-style medical mindset that treats symptoms as isolated parts. Instead, I started viewing the human body more like a high-dimensional nonlinear dynamical system, closer to an integrated complexity science involving viscoplasticity, topology, fatigue and rupture mechanics, systems engineering, and dynamic control theory. By focusing on the trajectory movie instead of isolated still snapshots, I was essentially applying control theory to biomedicine. I tried to identify the feedback loops that, when stabilized or dampened, could reduce the probability of catastrophic events such as stroke, vascular rupture, metabolic collapse, kidney failure, dementia progression, cancer, or progressive organ damage. Trajectory instead of snapshots. Over the past 17 years, I collected more than 4 million of personal lifestyle details and primary biomedical data points from my own body. This longitudinal dataset gradually allowed me to observe something that snapshot medicine often cannot easily detect. Disease progression is usually not a single event. It is a long trajectory of accumulated instability and damage, delayed feedback, structural deterioration, and repeated stress interactions over time. I also noticed that biomedical variables often interact more through a multiplicative structure than an additive structure. This realization eventually led me toward developing concepts such as viscoplastic medicine theory (VMT), topology-based trajectory analysis, strain-stress-energy relationships, and multiplicative interaction models such as TSI. Inspired by Newton's law of motion, F equals m times a. These models were not created to impress medical professionals or academic institutions. They were created because I needed practical tools to help me understand my own body and ultimately survive. This is part 1.